Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? To start this week, we'll cover the politics and get that out of the way very quickly. And then we'll move on to slightly less political news with a hormone-free male birth control pill, followed by weird human genetics and the fact that humanity, at least in terms of the Sahara, has a rather odd history, let's call it. Certain additions to your favourite flavoured beverage may increase your risk of type 2 diabetes, but only in combination with others. Drama around claims of resurrecting the direwolf after it went long extinct. Millions of bees are dying, and there are claims, in particularly America, that this is due to various pesticides and similar. A bizarre shape-shifting liquid, and how it's defying the laws of physics, and Amazon's first launch of its Kuiper satellites. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with the, let's call it unfortunate news. The Dr. Oz appears to be taking leadership of Medicare and MedicAid. We've covered this before, but the reality is Dr. Oz is someone who isn't consistent, isn't reliable, and often sells terrible products, if not directly, at least inadvertently by hosting them on his show. Now, you could argue that, oh, he's just trying to open your mind and give you other possibilities. That's true if any of the things he touted at one point or another actually had the science to back them up. As he himself has basically described it, much of what he's presented is magical. For those of you who aren't aware, magic is makeshift bullshit that people try and claim in order to justify giving you something that's never going to work. You just don't believe hard enough, is often the answer given. Despite this, he has basically been given a major leadership position in one of the major healthcare areas of government, much like R.F. Cray Cray. The downside is that, unlike R.F. Cray Cray, he actually has a degree in medicine and was at one point quite a good thoracic or cardiac surgeon. And, well, now he's a quack. So, from lauded doctor to snake oil salesman, it's a major fall from grace. Unfortunately, being a celebrity is also part of the reason why he's here. Further, he doesn't really have much in the way of, well, plans. And to be clear about it, we're not expecting a deep dive into exactly how he's going to make Medicare and Medicaid better, nor are we expecting some sort of grand tour where he'll find things to fix and improvements and tweaks. No, we just want something that says, between now and when I leave, this is what I want to get done, which hasn't really happened. Oh well. In slightly more useful news, we have what death may be helping in. Not the death of Dr. Oz, although that might be useful. Instead, it's the death of cells. In order for your body to heal, tissues that have been damaged must be removed. Now, not all tissue damage is going to be obvious when you're initially injured. A part of it is simply going to be that the cells that have been torn up and destroyed when you're injured, such as a cut or bruise, will send out a chemical signal saying, "I've died, please call help." It's kind of like the coffin dance, except rather than it's a bunch of people carrying a coffin, it's a bunch of dead cells crying out in the throes of death. Because of this, it causes a slight cascading effect. Now, some of the initial cells in the site of injury will die because of this, others will die because of exposure, and some again will simply die in a process called apoptosis. All of this is well and truly good, because it means you have a controlled area from which the body begins re-healing again. And this is where the research is particularly useful. What it's found is that signal which tells other cells to die is known as a caspase. And caspases not only cause the apoptosis of cells in the local area of damage, but they also send a signal to those cells that aren't in the immediate area of damage to say, okay, you're healthy and you're in no harm's way, you need to now start growing and replacing what we've lost. And that appears to be what they found in fruit flies, or Drosophila. So take it with a hefty amount of salt. But nonetheless, if this is true, and understand that's a massive question still, it could, and this is also under the very correct circumstances, so it's rather speculative, indicate a way to improve healing after, say, surgery or other rather invasive events where you have massive tissue damage and want a way to, well, try and recover from it. In something you may or may not want to recover from, we have the hormone-free male birth control pill. Now, this is not a new concept, it's basically been gone around the block hundreds if not thousands of times so far, with many attempts, and all of them a failure, to try and get something that will be the equivalent for a male as the female has with the oral contraceptive. It obviously hasn't worked, given that both many males are having children and leading to single-parent families, but also there's nothing on the market. There are several ways to try and get a contraceptive. The most successful so far has been anime and anime waifus. The second most successful way of keeping people from having children is having them have a child in the first place and learning from the first child this was a terrible idea. If you don't want to undergo the process of becoming a weeb or having a child, this third option could be the solution. It's a drug called YCT529, and, well, again, we're talking about an animal model here, so lots of salt, lots of skepticism, but moving on to clinical trials indicates that they're somewhat confident in this. But if you want to understand why previous attempts have failed, there is a card in the top corner you can look at. What they've done is they've taken, well, non-human primates, which is a simplified way of saying a monkey, and they've given it to those monkeys and to mice, and they all stop producing sperm with limited side effects. Limited being a very important thing here. However, the other catch to this is that basically they've had to make the same proviso as they do with condoms. Condoms are 99% effective, but you don't want to be that 1%, because unexpected pregnancies are not just unexpected, but often, well, rather disruptive in one way or another. The trial will be run in New Zealand, and this is going to be interesting, as New Zealand is famous for several things, one of which is basically being Hobbit land. So, presumably, as long as there are no hobbits around and no New Zealanders are getting frisky, they should be fine, unless they happen to come across a sheep, and we've yet to see any New Zealander cross-sheep hybrids, so we assume that it doesn't lead to anything anyway. In more worrying news that isn't related to furries in New Zealand, we have bird flu developing resistance. Now, this is actually not that surprising and not yet a worry, but it is something to be very much mindful of. What we're seeing is mutations in the bird flu strains that are currently circulating that would develop resistance to something like Tamiflu. Now, this is the current recommended treatment if you get infected as a human, so that's all well and good. The downside is that, well, it is an antiviral, which is a problem, because if we don't have an antiviral that works against bird flu, people are going to have a very rough time. Other than having a very bad time, we are fortunate in terms of what's actually been found. The two clades that are currently circulating basically were all susceptible to the go-to options, so that's okay. The problem is, well, Canadian, ironically enough. As polite as the Canadians are, the same thing doesn't extend to their viruses, and it would appear that mutations in the Canadian version of bird flu are showing signs of developing a gene that will confer resistance to that go-to antiviral medication. Not just is it spreading very quickly, as you would expect with something that's so polite, people aren't going to really get in its way, but it's spreading very quickly, and it's something we've seen before. The 2008-2009 flu season was particularly bad due to this. So, yeah, this is not a good sign for anybody, and it could go very bad very quickly if, as would be expected to be seen, the farm birds spread it to wild birds, and wild birds spread it to everywhere else because they migrate. Next we go to humans, but humans in the Sahara. The Sahara is somewhere that if you think of it, your first thought is inevitably going to be one of, you mean the giant desert? And yes, but it wasn't always so. At one point, that giant sandpit was actually a giant rainforest, and humans living there, at least according to the genetic evidence, were somewhat unique, and we say unique in a good way, sort of anyway. It's based on very small sample sizes, and by small we mean actually really tiny. It's just two individuals, females, who were buried at the Takakori rock shelter in what is now southwestern Libya. The women's remains were analysed, and the 15,000-year-old remains basically found that there were some weird peculiarities with their genes. And we say weird peculiarities in that not only are they rather old, but that they had less Neanderthal DNA than a lot of more northern samples. As fundamentally, the further north into Europe you get, the more Neanderthal DNA appears to show up. The researchers believe that this is evidence of a sort of reverse flow in genetics. In a very rough and simplified way of describing this, the DNA that would have left Africa in the form of migration out would have eventually found its way back in once Europeans started mixing at a genetic level with Neanderthals, and then that slowly worked its way back into Africa, which also shows why there's a sort of gradient on its way back in. On its way back in, we have Space Miso. And no, this isn't a weird jab at Japanese food, it's actually what has been done. The miso has been made in space, and it seems to have altered its flavour, which, depending on your view of miso, may or may not be possible. Some may find that it's literally just a fermented soybean paste that has a singular and very in-your-face aroma and taste. Others have said that it's far more, how do we describe this? Nuanced is perhaps the right word? The Space Miso was made on the ISS, and what they found was that it has a nuttier and more roasted taste than miso produced at the same time and roughly under the same conditions in the US and Denmark. This phenomena also opens up the theoretical opportunity for space-based sake, as what they use to turn the fermented soybeans into something useful is Aspergillus oryzae, the same fungus required to make sake. While it may sound weird, this actually does present a certain, let's say, microbial concerns if humans are going to spend significant times in space. And it comes down to this. The 3 batches, that is the one from space and the 2 from Earth, had notably different microbial populations, or at least when you compare the terrestrial to extraterrestrial samples. The Space Miso paste had more Staphylococcus epidermis and Staphylococcus warnii. Further, Bacillus valacensis was only found in the Space Miso samples. This does mean that anything we do in space has to be adjusted for based on the fact that the microbial populations within it will be notably different than what we're used to on Earth if we ever get into space on a larger scale. In further nutrition and diet related news, we have, well, for the most part we're going to be talking about things like carbonated beverages, soft drink, pop, soda, whatever you wish to call it. But the fact that certain additives, if you're using them in combination, could, and this is a massive could, increase the risk of type 2 diabetes. Understand that anytime you start drawing this many things together to form a pattern, it looks less like a pattern and more like either a child's scribble or a conspiracy theory. The Sorbonne Paris North University was conducting the research, and they were trying to analyze data to figure out if we have this particular group of people, roughly 108,000, and they follow them for so long and chart their diet records against type 2 diabetes, do we get anything interesting? And, well, any such observational study will typically find something of interest. Whether or not it's useful is where it gets to be very different. The first kind of, let's call it combination that's a risk, is going to be something that contains modified starches, so basically long starch chains have been broken down, such as highly processed flours, guar gum, and carrageenan. This is basically broths, dairy, desserts, sauces, and a few other things that increase risk by about 8%, although there's a little bit of variation again. The second had citric acid, sodium citrates, and artificial sweeteners, your soft drink ingredients, for all intents and purposes, and this did increase risk notably higher by about 13% versus the previous 8 or so. So this sounds like it should be pretty clear, that is, you have 2 different combinations and they show pretty clear results. Except when you look at the actual cohort they were analysing. This is where things get to be rather doubtful, let's call it. For starters, most of the people involved were women, so we don't really know if the findings they found, if you were to look at only the males, were actually reliable. Second, if it's only females, is there something similar in men, because you just wouldn't know at that point. And, well, there's a bunch of other issues, but still, this is at least something that's worth being aware of. Especially with what could be best described as a relatively humble effect of between 8 and 13 or so %. Typically speaking, when you look at those sorts of low numbers on such a long-term observational study like this, you have to have a lot of questions, and you have to be very skeptical. It's generally going to be a more, let's say, better explained model when you use confounding variables than when you just say, this is what we found. Which is why this study in particular is kind of disappointing in how it's being sold, let's say. And next is more a touting our own horn, so to say, and it's a post by Elon Musk saying that, well, their Optimus, or robot, will come in many forms, in response to a fake BBC headline talking about genetically engineered catgirls being possible. Scientists say, but we lack funding. Now, unfortunately, it is fake, but it's not impossible, as we've described previously. However, as we described, that's a biological process, and so using Optimus, a robot, is not really practical. But, in theory, we could get them, and a lot sooner than you'd imagine. Or at least, we hope. In slightly more, let's say, immediately relevant news, we have the claims that the direwolves have been brought back from extinction, and this has been, let's say, controversial. Now, the controversy is several-fold, but the first and simplest is that they had a relatively small number of genes that were either modified or added to an existing species of wolf. Now, this did alter the appearance, and we presume some of the behaviors and similar, of the otherwise, let's call it mundane or regular grey wolf. The important thing here is that they modified some of the genes. Now, modification can in the form of replacing it or just changing it, and so theoretically it should match with existing archaeological and fossil evidence of the wolf itself. However, does that actually make a, well, in this case, a direwolf? It is, in a manner of speaking, a kind of philosophical question, as it's closer to the Theseus ship question than it is the actual reality of what's happening. The Theseus ship question is basically, if you take a ship and you gradually replace every single thing that makes it up, at what point does it go from being the old ship to being a new ship? Is it once you replaced one plank, or once you replace 50%, or once you replaced every part of the ship entirely? In order to know if these are actually direwolves, we're going to have to look into quite a few things much later on, and that actually does presume that they survived that long, which, while morbid, is a necessary consideration given that they've made somewhat substantial genetic changes. The first is simply going to be, can they interbreed with, well, species other than their own, in which case it may not be considered a new species, or in this case the revival of an extinct species. The second is, does it behave differently to the existing grey wolf species, in which case maybe. And third, even if it was, for whatever reason, released into the wild, could it survive without having to be in a laboratory? If the answer to these three questions is no, you're going to have to ask the question of, have they just made a white grey wolf, which would then just be a white wolf, but presumably there are issues around calling it that. We could argue that this development, so to call it, is less useful in terms of what's actually been developed, but instead how it might be applied to those species we have now that are either very close to extinct or are recently extinct, and see if it wasn't possible to, at least theoretically, either, let's say, buff the species population by breeding new members, or by theoretically, well, resurrecting dead species that are more recently deceased. But then again, that also has all sorts of ethical issues around it. A scenario where this might be relevant is with regards to, say, hippos and similar large animals in Africa, but particularly hippos at the moment, as there's been a large number of them dying off due to anthrax. Yeah, this is perhaps unexpected, but it does make a great degree of sense once you see what's happening, or understand what's happening. Anthrax, or Bacillus anthracis, is a spore-forming bacterium that can survive for a stupid amount of time in soil as a spore. And because of this, it basically has its damage, it then goes into hiding and stays in hiding for decades, and then due to, say, dry weather, a particularly large herd of animals, or just plain unfortune, it gets kicked out of the soil and resurrects, and then it becomes transmissible again and infects people. In this case, it infects hippopotamuses. This has led to a large number of the hippos, about 50 of them, dying in Lake Edward, which is between the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Uganda. Do bear in mind that this is not something that will only affect hippos. There is a possibility that it could be spread to humans and therefore become a human issue as well as being a hippo issue. But for now, a panic is certainly not warranted. In similar but rather different news, we have bees. Bees also dying, rather than bees being in Africa. No doubt there are bees in Africa too, but they're not dying off as far as we're aware. Instead, there has been a large number of colonies just up and dying over the last 8 months or so across the US, and this is believed to be emerging as something of a crisis. Now, there are all kinds of ways this can happen, and sadly, some are immediately jumping on the idea of things like glyphosate are to blame, and that the use of pesticides and herbicides is what's doing this. And to some extent, they may have some claim to that, but it's also unlikely to be the exact cause, given the widespread nature of this and the differing times in application rates. As you can imagine, bees are rather important. They're not the sole pollinator out there, but they are a major pollinator, and therefore they play a significant role in the production of food. About 3/4 of all food that you're going to consume, with regards to fruits, nuts, and vegetables, rely on bees. So, yeah. They also are rather obviously responsible for the production of honey, and honey itself is worth, at least in the USA, about $15 billion. Research that's relying on more controlled environments has found that it's likely to be a combination of things like changing habitats and weather patterns, rather than things like pesticides and herbicides at this stage. Mostly because if you see the same phenomena occurring with a beehive in a controlled environment, that's really only fluctuating due to, say, exposure to temperature or similar, rather than exposure to pesticides and herbicides, you kind of can start ruling out herbicides and pesticides. In news that's slightly more, let's call it disconcerting and weird, it's using potatoes to produce milk. And no, not like vodka, although you could technically argue that vodka is a kind of potato milk, just not the sort you want to be eating on a regular basis. No, what's happened here is that to be blunt about this, the potatoes have been genetically modified, and what they've done is to try and, rather than make them resistant to diseases, make them produce something very similar to milk, which, yeah. Rather than outright milk though, milk being a relatively complicated product, they're looking at only making one specific protein within the potato. This is casein. Now, casein is the protein primarily responsible for things like cheese and similar, so you're not going to get things like lactose or other proteins and lipids within the potato, at least not the same you get from milk anyway. By doing it this way, you could theoretically lower the environmental impact and some of the cost in making cheese, although whether or not you could still call it cheese at this point is a big question. It does make us wonder though, how are you going to get the little cups on the potato and keep it so the potato doesn't get sucked down along with everything else? Okay, bad jokes aside, let's shift to thermodynamics pending weird discoveries, and literally, it's something that theoretically is, well, not necessarily breaking, but certainly distorting the laws of thermodynamics. The general rule is, you put a liquid, or for that matter a cat, into a container and it will assume the shape of whatever container you've used. However, a cat can also maintain its own shape. This is why cats are both liquids and solids. Liquids, by definition, only assume the shape of whatever container they're in. This thing doesn't do that though. It instead forms a slightly odd structure, which is in some ways not necessarily wrong, but also definitely not right. What the researchers have done here is take oil and water and separate it using a small, thin layer of magnetized particles. By doing this, they've been able to do the typical oil and water separation with a nice distinctive line. But there's one other feature to this that isn't so normal, and that is, if you look at it from the side, you'll note that it curves in at the top, sort of like a cup, or as it's described, a Grecian urn shape. This is where, to some extent, various buzzwords from Hollywood and other fictional settings are really to come into play, primarily thermodynamics and magnetism. What happens is because you have immiscible liquids, primarily speaking here about the oil and the water, pulling on the contents of the magnetic content, separating the two, you get weird phenomena that just doesn't follow the normal laws of thermodynamics, that being things at rest should stay at rest. Followed by, if something has high energy, it will eventually try and enter into a low energy state in order to get rid of that energy and therefore reach a state of happiness. Sort of anyway. Honestly, given the weirdness of this, trying to explain it in greater depth is going to require its own dedicated video, which may or may not happen one day. In the next piece of news item, we have, well, good intentions, but absolutely no plans to actually put them into effect, and it's a very simple article that says, harnessing artificial intelligence to transform Alzheimer's disease research. Well, okay, this sounds great. After all, AI is supposed to be the future. And nobody knows what the future is, but everybody says it's the future. So, obviously that's going to be the case. But what they have here is more or less the absolute and complete embodiment of the underwear gnomes approach. That is, get thing, this being AI, somehow apply it to Alzheimer's disease research, and finally, get results and presumably profit. Yeah, this is where actually having substance to your, well, in this case, abstract, would be particularly nice, but no. They just told us what they want to do and not how they're going to do it. Shifting to more real news and something that is quite immediately relevant, we have Amazon launching satellites, specifically their Cooper satellites. Now this is meant to occur sometime around April 9th, although exactly when will vary depending on how things work out. And to be blunt about it, well, launches both to and from space have been relatively unpredictable lately, with most recently astronauts being stranded on the ISS for many months. The difference between this and, well, other launches is that it won't be using Musk's rockets. Instead, it will be actually launching on the Atlas V rockets from Cape Canaveral, so essentially a NASA launch rather than a SpaceX launch. Now, that's not going to change much, except that this will actually be a competition to Starlink, so there is some benefit to it. And not only can Amazon now deliver your package in record time by forcing their drivers to pee into bottles, but they can also provide you with internet by which you buy your crap from them. It's basically work at Amazon to pay for Amazon so that you can work at Amazon. South Park had things oddly specifically, accurately, reliably correct this week, and their ability to predict the future is getting uncanny. The last news item we have for you might well be the future as well, and it might well predict what will happen. And it's that lichen could theoretically survive on Mars, and survive well enough that they would thrive. Now, this is possibly and very vaguely useful if you want to start terraforming Mars before humans get there. Which, well, it would be nice if we could faster colonize Mars, but it would also drastically cut down the time we have to actually explore Mars and see what's there, well, with it being how it is already. Lichen or lichen, however you wish to call it, can survive under the most harsh of conditions. Basically, any environment so barren and dead as to be completely inhospitable to any other life could still support lichen or lichen to some extent. Now, this is useful because, to start things, they would then allow for the production of oxygen on Mars, a rather important thing to have for humans because, for some odd reason, we need oxygen. It's just one of those things that, as a habit, you just can't quite kick, no matter how much you try. This research comes out of Poland, and it's a combination of universities and the Academy of Science trying to figure out whether or not you could do so, based on the Martian soil conditions. Conditions that are, to be blunt about it, not exactly conducive to life. Because of that, the fact that, well, lichen can survive so well, and its fungal partner or symbiote can undergo the necessary metabolism, means that it would survive quite well and quite successfully. If it does that, well, things are looking very promising. If for no other reason, then once you actually get a colony on Mars, you could possibly be using this as a way of producing oxygen and recycling various waste products. Of the 2 species experimented with that were exposed to roughly a year's worth of radiation at a time, one survived successfully, and this was the species that had a kind of calcium oxalate crystal both inside and outside of it, which appears to be what protected it from most of, if not the worst of, the radiation damage, compared to the other species which, while able to survive in far worse conditions on Earth, didn't have the same protection from radiation. So theoretically, how do we use these options, and more importantly, how do we prevent these science experiments from turning into something monstrous and creating a portal to hell, where we then need Doomslayer to rescue us? Just a thought. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, and please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.